The crystal chandeliers of the Drake Hotel glittered above the 41st anniversary gala for Vanguard Logistics. I stood in the shadows, clutching a club soda, watching the empire my father built celebrate without me. Suddenly, a hand thrust an empty champagne flute into my chest. I looked up to see my brother, Tyler, smirking. "Make yourself useful, Leora," he sneered, loud enough for the board members to hear. "Find a tray." The circle of executives erupted in laughter. I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. I simply took the sticky glass from his hand, my face a mask of absolute stone. He saw submission. I saw the final motivation I needed to burn his kingdom down. Have you ever been made to feel like a stranger in your own family? Drop a yes in the comments if you know exactly how that feels. I want to hear your story. I retreated to the shadows, finding a vantage point behind a towering floral arrangement where I could observe the room without being seen. It was a position I knew well. From here, I watched the court of the Golden Suns. Tyler and Brandon were holding court near the center of the room, surrounded by a sycophantic orbit of hangers-on. Old money friends, and people hoping to get close to the Vanguard fortune. They were loud, they were drunk, and they were careless. "Dad's finally selling," Tyler announced, his voice carrying over the jazz quartet. 85 million. Can you believe it? The old man is finally cashing out. Brandon clinked his glass against Tyler's fresh one. About time. He's been holding onto the reins like they're the only thing keeping him alive. I've already got a deposit down on a Sunseeker. Custom build. Italian leather. The works. A Sunseeker? Tyler scoffed. I'm looking at a villa in Tuscany. Somewhere with a vineyard. I'm done with Chicago winters. Once the check clears, I'm gone. They spoke about our father, Frank, as if he were already a corpse. As if his life's work, the company he had built from a single truck into a global logistics network, was nothing more than an ATM machine waiting to dispense their inheritance. They didn't talk about legacy. They didn't talk about the employees. They talked about toys. And then, the conversation turned to me. "What about Leora?" someone asked. A woman I didn't recognize. "Does she get a cut?" Tyler laughed. A harsh, barking sound. "Leora? Please. She's a logistics analyst. A clerk. She makes 50 grand a year tracking shipping containers. She wouldn't know what to do with real money if it hit her in the face. She's sweet. Though," Brandon added, his tone dripping with condescension, in a pathetic sort of way. "We'll probably have to set up some kind of allowance for her. You know, so she doesn't starve. But she's not capable. Girls like her, they need looking after. Logistics is a man's game." I listened, and I felt a strange, cold calm settle over me. This was their fatal flaw, their misogyny. It wasn't just that they didn't like me, it was that they fundamentally didn't respect me. They saw a woman in a cheap suit and assumed weakness. They saw a quiet demeanor and assumed stupidity. They saw a lack of flash and assumed a lack of substance. They didn't realize that while they were busy buying toys and planning vacations, I had been studying market caps. While they were networking at country clubs, I was analyzing balance sheets. While they were treating the company like a personal piggy bank, I was learning how to buy it. They thought I was the help. They thought I was a charity case. They had absolutely no idea that I was the shark in the water. Circling. Waiting. Watching. They were so busy looking at their reflection in the mirror. They didn't see the predator standing right behind them. They saw the clerk. They saw the quiet sister who brought potato salad to the picnics and sat at the kids' table. They never saw the other Leora, the one who existed between the hours of 6 p.m. and 2 a.m. For 8 years, I lived a double life. By day, I punched the clock at Vanguard. I tracked containers. I filed reports. I let Tyler mansplain supply chain economics to me, nodding politely while he got the basic terminology wrong. I let Brandon steal my ideas and present them as his own in meetings, shrinking into my chair when he took the credit. I played the role they wrote for me perfectly. The dutiful, dull, dependable daughter, but by night, I was someone else entirely. I was the founder of Summit Enterprises. I started it in my studio apartment with a laptop, a terrifying amount of coffee, and a small inheritance from my grandmother that I had hidden from everyone. I didn't buy shoes. I didn't buy purses. I bought distressed assets. I learned the brutal, beautiful language of private equity. I remember the first year. The exhaustion was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest. I would leave the Vanguard office, take the train home, and immediately log into my trading terminal. I taught myself forensic accounting. I learned how to spot the cracks in a company's foundation that no one else could see. I remember the first acquisition. A small, failing trucking fleet in Ohio. Everyone said it was dead weight. I saw a logistics hub. I bought it for pennies. Restructured the debt. Modernized the dispatch system. And sold it 18 months later for a 400% profit. That was the drug. The validation. The proof that I wasn't useless. Year 3. I acquired a mid-sized warehousing firm. Year 5. I moved into tech-enabled logistics. Summit Enterprises grew. It wasn't just a side hustle anymore. It was a player. A quiet, faceless, lethal player in the market. Why did I stay silent? Why didn't I shove my success in their faces? Why did I let them treat me like garbage for nearly a decade? Because of the trap of normalized cruelty. When you grow up being the scapegoat, you learn that speaking up doesn't get you heard. It gets you punished. You learn that shining too bright just attracts lightning. So you learn to hide your light. You learn to bury your power deep, where no one can touch it. I wasn't hiding out of fear. Not anymore. I was hiding out of strategy. I realized that my anonymity was my greatest weapon. As long as they thought I was nothing, they would never see me coming. They would never guard their flanks. They would never check the locks on the back door. I was observing the prey from the long grass. I watched Tyler funnel company money into a shell corporation for consulting fees. I watched Brandon leverage company assets to cover his gambling debts. I watched them rot the company from the inside out. I didn't stop them. I didn't report them. I bought their debt. Every time they took out a loan they couldn't pay, Summit Enterprises was there to buy the note. Every time they leveraged a property, Summit was the shadow lender. I built a paper trail of their incompetence. A chain of evidence that linked their greed directly to my bank account. They thought they were the kings of the world. They didn't know they were living in a house of cards. And I was the one holding the match. 1 week later, my father called a mandatory emergency meeting in the main boardroom. He sat at the head of the long mahogany table, looking older than his 72 years. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, sealing us in. "It's done," Frank said, his voice heavy with a mix of relief and resignation. "I've accepted an acquisition offer. Vanguard Logistics is being sold for $85 million. The silence lasted exactly 1 second before Tyler and Brandon erupted. They high-fived across the table, the sound cracking like a whip. They didn't look at Dad. They didn't look at the legacy that was ending. They looked at each other, their eyes glazing over with the reflection of dollar signs. They were already spending money they hadn't touched yet. Then, Tyler turned his gaze to me. He put on a mask of exaggerated, sickening pity. "Leora," he said, his voice dropping to a fake whisper. "I know this is scary for you. New owners usually clean house. The clerical staff is always the first to go." "Yeah," Brandon chimed in, leaning back in his chair with a smug grin. "But don't worry. I think Sis will put in a good word. Maybe they'll keep you on as a receptionist if we ask nicely. You know, since you need the health insurance." I stared at them, my expression unmoving. They thought they were being benevolent. I knew the truth. I had seen the emails. During my due diligence on Vanguard's internal servers, I had found a thread between Tyler, Brandon, and our father's estate attorney. They had spent the last 3 years gaslighting Frank. They told him I was drowning in credit card debt. They told him I was emotionally unstable. They told him I had poor judgment and that giving me any voting shares or equity would be dangerous. They had systematically painted me as a liability to ensure that when the sale happened, the proceeds would be split 2 ways, not 3. They hadn't just underestimated me. They had actively framed me. "I appreciate your concern," I said, my voice flat, "but I think I'll be fine." "That's the spirit," Tyler said, dismissing me with a wave of his hand. He stood up and walked to the sidebar, grabbing a bottle of Cristal he had clearly brought for this exact moment. He popped the cork, the foam spilling onto the expensive carpet. "To the buyer," Tyler shouted, pouring 3 glasses, 1 for Dad, 1 for Brandon, 1 for himself. He didn't pour 1 for me. "To Summit Enterprises. Whoever those faceless corporate raiders are. They just made us kings." "To Summit," Brandon echoed, raising his glass high. "Those suits won't know what hit them. We'll run circles around them." They clinked their glasses, the crystal chiming in the air. They drank deep, swallowing the expensive champagne, laughing at the faceless entity they believed they had conquered. I watched them drink. I watched the liquid slide down their throats. They were toasting their own executioner. They were celebrating the arrival of the guillotine, completely unaware that the blade was already falling. They called Summit Enterprises faceless. They were wrong. Summit had a face. It was sitting right across the table, watching them with cold, dead eyes. The heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open, admitting a phalanx of suits. 3 lawyers from the firm of Sterling and Associates marched in, their leather briefcases swinging in unison like pendulums counting down the remaining seconds of my brother's careers. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The smell of expensive champagne soured, replaced by the sterile scent of legal toner and starch. My father, Frank, checked his Rolex. He frowned, a deep crease appearing between his gray brows. He looked past the lawyers, scanning the empty hallway behind them. "Where are they?" Frank asked, his voice tight with the impatience of a man who hadn't waited for anyone in 40 years. "Where is the representative from Summit? It's unprofessional to be late to a closing." Tyler leaned back in his chair, swirling the last dregs of his cristal. He loosened his tie, his face flushed and oily. "Relax, Dad. These corporate types love to make an entrance, probably stuck in traffic in a rented limo. They want us to sweat a little. It's a power move." "Yeah," Brandon added, propping his feet up on the rung of his chair. "Let them play their games. We've got the deal. They can show up whenever they want, as long as the check clears." I looked at the clock on the wall. 2:15. Exact timing. I pushed my chair back. The sound of the wood scraping against the carpet was sharp and violent in the sudden quiet. It cut through the low murmur of the lawyers arranging their documents. I stood up. I didn't smooth my skirt. I didn't clear my throat. I just stood there, a solitary figure in a room full of men who had spent a lifetime trying to make me invisible. "They aren't late, Dad," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it didn't shake. It was the voice I used when I negotiated 7-figure acquisitions at 3 a.m. Tyler rolled his eyes, not even bothering to look at me fully. "Sit down. Leora, the adults are doing business. Go check with the secretary if they're in the lobby." "I don't need to check the lobby," I said, my eyes locked on her father. "I'm here." Frank blinked, confusion clouding his eyes. "What?" "The representative from Summit Enterprises," I said, enunciating every syllable. "I'm here." The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was a vacuum. It sucked the air out of the room. I could hear the hum of the air conditioning. I could hear the ice shifting in the silver bucket. I could hear the sudden, sharp intake of breath from the lead attorney who knew exactly what was about to happen. Tyler let out a laugh. It was a wet, nervous sound that died halfway up his throat. "Okay. Very funny," he sneered, his smile tight and brittle. "You almost had me for a second. Now sit down before you embarrass yourself. You're acting hysterical." I didn't answer him. I reached down and lifted my battered leather briefcase onto the mahogany table. It was the same briefcase they had made fun of for years, calling it my school bag. Click, click. The sound of the brass latches opening echoed like gunshots. I reached inside and pulled out a heavy binder. It was bound in navy blue leather, with gold foil stamping on the cover. Summit Enterprises. Acquisition Agreement. Vanguard Logistics. I slid the binder across the polished wood. It glided smoothly, stopping inches from Frank's hands. "Open it," I said. Frank looked at the binder, then at me. His hands were trembling slightly as he reached out and flipped the cover open. He turned to the signature page. I watched his eyes scan the text. I saw the moment his brain registered the ink. I saw the color drain from his face, leaving him gray and ghostly. "Leora Henderson," he whispered, reading the signature aloud. "CEO and founder." Tyler scrambled out of his chair, nearly knocking it over. He grabbed the binder from Dad's hands, his eyes frantic. That's fake. You forged this. This is a joke." "It's not a joke, Tyler," I said, my voice dropping an octave. Cold and absolute. "It's a contract." I walked around the table until I was standing at the head, right next to my father. I looked down at my brothers. They looked small. They looked like children playing dress-up in men's suits. "I am Summit Enterprises," I said. "I founded it in the studio apartment you mocked. I funded it with the money you thought I didn't have. I built it while you were sleeping, while you were drinking, While you were stealing. I placed my hand flat on the table. And as of this morning, the wire transfer is complete. I didn't just coordinate the logistics for this meeting. I bought you out. The room didn't just go quiet, it died. The air conditioning hummed like a flatline. Tyler stared at the binder, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. He looked at the signature, then at me, then at the lawyers. Desperate for someone to tell him this was a hallucination. You. He stammered, the sweat on his forehead gleaming under the boardroom lights. You can't afford this. You drive a Honda. You live in a shoebox. This is $85 million. Leora. That's real money. It is. I agreed. My voice calm. Almost bored. And Summit Enterprises manages a portfolio worth $750 million. My personal valuation as of the last audit is $520 million. So yes. Tyler. I can afford it. In fact, I bought it with cash reserves. I saw the number hit him like a physical blow. $520 million. For his entire life. Tyler had measured his worth by the size of the check Dad wrote him. He believed he was a giant because he stood on a mountain of money he didn't build. But in that moment, the mountain vanished, and he realized he was standing in a hole. This is the illusion of power that comes from an empty wallet. I watched him shrink. It wasn't a metaphor. He physically seemed to lose inches. His shoulders collapsed. His chest caved in. It's a fascinating psychological phenomenon to witness up close. When a person's entire identity is constructed around having, rather than having the car. Having the name. Having the inheritance stripping away the assets doesn't just make them poor. It makes them cease to exist. He wasn't Tyler Henderson. Heir to the throne. He was just a man in a suit he couldn't pay for. Staring at a woman who had outpaced him in a race he didn't even know was happening. Brandon. Always the weasel. Tried to pivot. He forced a smile that looked more like a grimace. Well. This is great, he choked out, looking frantically at Dad. I mean, it stays in the family. Right? That's what matters. Leora. You really got us. Wow. But hey. We can work with this. We know the operations. We can run the day-to-day while you handle the money stuff. Yeah. Tyler latched onto the lifeline. Exactly. We're a team. You need us. Leora. The crew knows us. They trust us. I looked at Frank. He was still staring at the binder. His face gray. He wanted to believe them. I could see it in his eyes, the desperate hope of a father who didn't want to admit his sons were failures. He wanted to believe that despite the shock, we could all just shake hands and play happy family. I didn't buy this company to partner with you, I said, cutting through their delusion. And I certainly didn't buy it to let you run it. Come on. Leora. Tyler pleaded, his voice whining now. We've been grooming this place for sale for years. We know where the bodies are buried. We have a plan for the transition. I know you have a plan, I said. I read it. I reached back into my briefcase. This time, I didn't pull out a leather-bound contract. I pulled out a simple, stapled stack of emails. I tossed them onto the table. They fanned out, sliding across the polished wood until they rested directly in front of Dad. What is this? Frank asked, his voice hoarse. That, I said, is the correspondence between Tyler, Brandon, and the acquisition team at Red Star Logistics, our biggest competitor. Tyler went white. Dead white. Dad, I said, keeping my eyes fixed on my brothers. They weren't planning to run the company. They weren't planning to preserve your legacy. They had a side deal with Red Star. I pointed to the top email. Read the highlighted paragraph. Frank picked up the paper. His hand shook so badly the paper rattled. He read aloud, his voice trembling. Contingent upon the immediate liquidation of the pension fund. Once the inheritance transfer is finalized, we will initiate the mass layoff of the warehouse staff approx. 400 employees, by Q3 to streamline assets for the asset strip sale to Red Star. Estimated exit bonuses for T. Henderson and B. Henderson, $12 million each. The silence returned. But this time it was heavy. Suffocating. It was the sound of a heart breaking. Frank looked up. He looked at his sons. The men he had defended. The men he had bailed out. The men he had chosen over me. Time and time again. You were going to fire them? Frank whispered. Old Miller? Susan and Dispatch? The people who built this place? Dad. It's just business, Brandon stammered, backing away as if Frank might hit him. The market is changing. We had to be smart. You were going to sell it for parts. Frank roared. The sound was guttural. A release of 40 years of pride being fed into a shredder. You were going to strip it and sell it to Red Star for a bonus, behind my back? We didn't have a choice, Tyler shouted, his facade cracking completely. You weren't giving us enough. 85 million split 3 ways isn't enough to live on. Not with the lifestyle we have. We needed the exit bump. 3 ways? I interrupted, my voice ice cold. You told Dad I was incompetent so you could split it 2 ways. Don't lie to him now. You aren't even good at it. I looked at Frank. He seemed to have aged 10 years in 10 minutes. He slumped in his chair. The betrayal physical in its intensity. He had built a legacy thinking he was building it for kings, only to realize he had raised vultures. I didn't buy the company to keep it in the family. Dad, I said softly. I bought it to save it from them. I turned to the lawyers, who had been watching the scene with the stoic professionalism of undertakers. Gentlemen, I said, please proceed with the final clause of the acquisition. Tyler looked around wildly. What clause? What are you talking about? The clause regarding outstanding liabilities, I said. You see, Tyler, when I bought the company, I didn't just buy the assets. I bought the debts. Specifically, the personal loans you both took out against your future equity, the loans you used to buy your condos, your cars, your lifestyles. I smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. I own your debt now, and I'm calling it in. You can't do that, Tyler whispered, his voice trembling. That's my house. That's my life. Technically, I corrected, closing the binder with a final, satisfying snap. It was the bank's house, and since I bought the note from the bank this morning, it's my house, along with your Porsche, Brandon's beach cottage, and the credit lines you've both maxed out. I turned to the head of security, who had been waiting quietly by the door. Escort Mr. Henderson and Mr. Henderson out of the building, I said. They are no longer employees of Vanguard Logistics. Their access badges are deactivated effective immediately. If they attempt to access company servers or premises, press charges for corporate espionage. Leora, please, Brandon begged, tears actually welling in his eyes. We're family. You fired family when you planned to sell this place for scraps, I said. Now, get out. I watched them go. They didn't leave with dignity. They left arguing with security, blaming each other, their voices fading down the hallway until the heavy doors clicked shut, sealing the silence. It was just me and Dad. Frank sat at the head of the table, looking at the empty chairs where his golden sons had sat moments ago. He looked at the email printouts. Then he looked at me. He didn't say he was sorry. Sorry was too small a word for 8 years of neglect. Instead, he did something better. He stood up. He walked over to the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline, the city he had conquered 40 years ago. Then he turned back to the mahogany table. He walked to the head chair, the CEO's chair, and he pulled it out. He gestured to it. I built this company thinking I was building a legacy for them, Frank said, his voice rough. I was blind. I didn't see that the only person tough enough to hold it together was the one I kept sending to fetch coffee. He looked me in the eye. It's your chair, Leora. It always was. I walked to the head of the table. I sat down. The leather was cool against my back. It fit perfectly. I looked out the window at the sprawling city below. I wasn't the clerk anymore. I wasn't the ghost. I wasn't the help. I was the titan, and I hadn't waited for permission to take my place. I had built the throne myself. Leora proved that silence isn't weakness, it's preparation. If you're building your empire in the shadows right now, hit that like button, and share this story with someone who needs to be reminded. Your time is coming. Keep grinding.